The Art of War has been considered the definitive text on military strategy and warfare ever since being written in ancient China around 500 BC, inspiring businesses, athletes, and of course generals to beat their opponents in competition the right way until today. Chapter 1. Sun Tzu initializes the book by discussing the importance of proper pre-conflict planning. The emphasis of this chapter is to be prepared for ongoing changes in the war conditions. He lists 5 fundamental factors that should be considered during this planning stage: moral influence, weather, terrain, command, and doctrine. When elaborating on moral influence, I was rather confused. The higher significance is that the commander should assess the people's relationship with regards to their governance. Unsure if he meant that the people were the subordinates of his command, the enemy's command, or of the enemy's nation. Nonetheless, the importance of moral assessment is still relevant. Next, he discusses the importance of planning based on weather conditions. The goal is to move ground troops during an optimal time so that their arrival will not decrease morale. The purpose of this planning is so that the troops can be at an optimal condition when engaging with the enemy. This is to be extended in our life as your ability to plan for likely contingencies so that you can be prepared when engaging with the enemy of your life: emotional, financial, relationship distress, etc. Finally, the last 2 factors involve command and doctrine. The command is the assessment of the commander's reputation with the subordinates and competency. Are they leading or commanding? That too is another determining factor for willingness to listen to orders given by individuals on the hierarchy. Then there is doctrine, which is comprised of organization, control, assignment of appropriate ranks of officers, regulation of supply routes, and the provision of principal items used by the army. This element of planning is so quintessential that he asserts, those who master them win, those who do not are defeated. In any case, you, like the commander, should continually change your tactics by accurately assessing the ever-evolving conditions that may be presented in front of you. Chapter 2. This chapter is seemingly more directly related to the act of war. However, the instruction can leak into your life as well. Sun Tzu argues that the support of the army sent into battle via the equipment and provisioning are both imperative if you are to execute based on speed and decisiveness. This relates back to the principles of Ray Dalio. Create principles ahead of time so that in the heat of the moment you are executing decisiveness with immense speed and rational. He later declares that those adept in waging war do not require a second levy of conscripts nor more than one provisioning. Appending to his statement, it is suggested that the proper use of enemy resources, if captured, can ensure such victory. Continually assess your subordinates' mental and physical health to plan properly in accordance with their current state. This can be used with employees, spouses, students, and children, and remember that the commanding line must be direct, clear, and concise. Chapter 3. This chapter was interesting in that they focused on preventative tactics, which are, in my opinion, the most effective method for executing an attack. Sun Tzu states, to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. With careful planning, the commander can successfully subdue the enemy more effectively, with far fewer casualties, juxtaposed to a head-on mindless attack. The Grand Duke was quoted saying, "He who excels at resolving difficulties does so before they arise." He said that the Hail Mary of attacks is to lay siege on the city. A more sophisticated method would be to separate the enemies from their allies and resources and then attack when vulnerable. Patience is a virtue, and more so when engaging in warfare. Learning to control the passions, as Marcus Aurelius calls it, is the best solution to prevent your troops from being needlessly killed. Towards the end of the chapter, Sun Tzu reflects on the 5 circumstances in which victory may be predicted. Here the circumstances are contingent on the commanding general's knowledge of several things. 1. Knowing as much about himself and his own troops as about those of the opposition, the competition in business or athletics, so that he will know when to advance and when to retreat. 2. Knowing the correct use of both small, highly specialized teams, and large forces, high quantities of resources like money or manpower. 3. Knowing how to forge ranks unified in purpose, disseminate the why. 4. Knowing how to exercise patience when the opposition does not. This is imperative with anything in life, especially relationships and heated arguments. And 5. Knowing that his sovereign does not interfere with his decisions. Less relevant to us, but if you are a high-level exec, parent, or teacher, consider you the sovereign. The last point is a direct reflection of Jocko's book Dichotomies of Leadership. The sovereign, CEO, parent, manager, teacher, etc., appoints a general, any subordinate aka a JR leader, with the trust to act with immediate and decisive action. So the sovereign must trust the subordinate, while the subordinate, general, must simultaneously fulfill the trust placed in him. Chapter 4. This chapter can be concisely summarized with the common idiom "don't count your chickens before they hatch," with a bit of a twist. Sun Tzu talks about the story of 2 opposing generals who were confronted in conflict. One of the Chao armies was arrogantly thinking that their victory was secured. To Tzu, this obvious was merely misapprehension, reiterating the importance of the obvious never being the case. So to investigate the problem thoroughly and do not overlook the details. This is something stressed by Jocko as well in his planning section. The wise commander prepares well ahead of time by any means possible, ready to take advantage of any opportunity. Lastly, Sun Tzu presents elements of war which mirrors an almost Taoist mentality. 1. Measurement of space. 2. Estimation of quantities. 3. Calculations. 4. Comparisons, and 5. Chances of victory. Once again accentuating the importance of proper planning and not overlooking the obvious as such, he states, a victorious army wins its victories before seeking battle, an army destined to defeat fights in the hope of winning. Chapter 5. The primary premise of this chapter is to highlight the significance of creating order amidst chaos by building well-structured ranking hierarchies. Chang Yu describes how a pyramid of command is built from the base at the bottom, individual soldiers, up through each level, pair, trio, squad, section, platoon, company, battalion, regiment, group, brigade, and finally, army. This ranking structure is to be enforced as a collective just as it should be respected on an individual level. The emphasis of the chapter is to create order within the ranks and ensure inferiors follow the command of the superiors. And ensure that the superiors are planning properly to ensure the safety of the subordinates, to maintain trust and respect. See Chapter 3, in addition to successfully completing the objective and mission victory. Chapter 6. Deception is the name of this chapter. Not really, just the main topic. Here the victory's general is successful when capable of misleading the opposing commanders into believing a swift victory lies ahead. Consider this tactic like a carrot and a stick method. You are to lead the animal easily with bait to move it into position or todo as you desire. Same concept here with deception with the enemy. You must continually change your tactics according the ever-evolving conditions of the battlefield. He concludes by stating that the best way to lead an unsuspecting enemy into a trap is to make them believe there is a route of escape. This misguiding deception will leave the opposing troops vulnerable to the well-planned attack. This is most notably applicable in the business place. You must keep your secrets hidden from the opposition. Leak false information so that your competition can act accordingly, leaving you with the advantage to execute based on what you actually intended. Chapter 7. To be honest, I read this chapter on the plane and lost my notes. So I don't have comments or summary on this one, haha. Sorry. Chapter 8. Chapter 8 begins with Sun Tzu listing various grounds that are to be fought on based on the battle conditions. These grounds are: 1. Low-lying, in which an army should not camp. 2. Communicating, in which allies may be joined. 3. Desolate, to be moved through as quickly as possible. 4. Enclosed, requiring resourceful solutions to get out of, and 5. Death, in which the only option is to fight. Once again, the autonomy of JR leaders, commanders appointed by the sovereign, is imperative on the battlefield, as their ability to make quick, decisive decisions that ensure victory is crucial for success. Inaction is action within itself. Commentator Chia Lin suggests that ground is not to be fought for if one knows it will be difficult to defend, or that he gains no advantage by obtaining it. The chapter ends with Sun Tzu proposing to exploit the passions of the opposing general, such as channeling inner demons like sloth, perversion, greed, etc. Warfare is more than men and blood, it's also a game of the mind. Use that to your advantage when confronted by your enemy. Study them and their weaknesses and exploit it. In the business world, this may be rather unethical, such as leading an unsuspecting competitor into performing immoral acts that may negatively tarnish their respected reputation. So, this is a great tactic, but I do suggest you do so in ethical boundaries. Chapter 9. Sun Tzu addresses the prominence of taking advantage of surrounding terrain when prepping encampment. He prescribes taking the sunny side and rest your right and rear on them. He then discussed interpreting the acute signs found in nature, such as the correlation of low-hanging dust columns which would indicate chariots and cavalry. The value in observing such signs can be extended into the business world as well. You may notice acute changes from your competitor. Maybe a new marketing focus, new material used, more shipments of a certain component, etc. Using these observations with careful analysis can give you foresight that could easily be used for your inevitable victory. Once again, he accentuates the importance of maintaining control within your rank. Chapter 10. Appending from the previous chapter, Sun Tzu begins the chapter with the discussion of the mental component of the ground. The physical ground is important, but it carries equal weight as that of the psychological ground. He later explains and extrapolates on the one or combination of 6 distinctive types of psychological grounds: accessible, entrapping, indecisive, constricted, precipitous, and distant. Sun Tzu emphasizes the healthy psychology of the leading commander. You are as strong as your weakest link, and if the weakest link happens to be the head of the hierarchy, then failure is imminent. He supplements his statement with another: because even a valiant officer cannot make up for a poorly trained unit, and a well-trained unit cannot overcome poor leadership. Just as we have read in Jocko's book The Dichotomy of Leadership, Sun Tzu expresses the need for a leader to not become too compassionate for the troop. He treats them as his own beloved sons and they will die with him. It is the general's obligation to detect and address problems within the ranks, being certain to immediately extinguish them. The army, team, family, class, is a single unit, a body, and to operate fluidly the leadership must ensure that the subcomponents are operating flawlessly through continual monitoring and assessment/repair. Chapter 11. This chapter was dense. He elaborated on the multiple grounds discussed in previous chapters in greater detail. There are grounds that should avoid conflicts such as dispersive, within one's own territory, frontier, making a shallow penetration into enemy land, and key, neutral, or mutually advantageous. Then there is the communicating ground, which is expanded in level to accommodate fortifications, which is contingent on the general's ability to maintain order and formation. Then he discusses focal ground, which constitutes an opportunity to gain allies. This approach is rather difficult as you must take careful preparation and precautions to ensure that the newly gained ally will not turn on a moment's notice or worse, drive you into believing they are against your opponent, to begin with. Then when fully immersed in enemy territory you are trekking towards serious ground. This brings many possibilities for victory and plunder of good and provisions, yet he notes that this ground is difficult to return from. He navigates towards the more desperate ground where you are pinned against hard terrain and opposing enemy forces. This usually requires devised stratagems. This ground is encircled. Lastly, the ninth classification of ground is and arguably the one with the most severe consequences: death. You gotta fight for your life. If you find yourself in a position of offense as your only means for defense, then you should rely heavily on leadership and training leading up to the point. This is proposed by Sun Tzu to be the reason why a prepared leader with quick decisiveness is important to ensure the objective is won and the men are safe. Once again, preemptive precautions of deception could prevent such a problem from propagating. Then he reiterates the importance of needing your men to respect and obey commands by forging a fatherly love relationship that is both compassionate and stern, once again balancing a dichotomy found in leadership as per Jocko. He wraps the chapter by discussing the hegemonic king. The king snatches the position of authority, which revisits the questionably dangerous focal ground. There is no forging of allies, instead you are tasked with keeping them at arm's distance away from the enemy, and other would-be allies. This eliminates the risk of the enemy turning your newly gained ally into another opposing force, once again allowing your deceptive tactics to flourish. This also presents immense authority as you are not splitting the difference. Chapter 12. The last chapter is focused primarily on warfare tactics with fire. I couldn't think of clever analogies for this with business or life. Maybe fire could be used metaphorically for something else. But he is basically stating that you use careful preparation when using fire, taking multiple factors into account before executing. Then once fired off, LOLPUNZ, you must wait for the enemy's response. If they are catalyzed to a state of confusion, then you must attack, otherwise practice patience and inaction.